The European Union has cut off funding to all Israeli entities that operate in the disputed areas of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Now, this is part of EU pressure on Israel to keep inside its original borders before their expansion in 1967. This decision will affect more than 500,000 Israeli settlers and has provoked an angry reaction from Tel Aviv. But Europe says that it has merely formalized a position that had been stated many times before. RT's Paul Slier has more now.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is furious with this new European Union directive, and a number of leading Israeli officials have called it an earthquake. What it states is that in any future agreements between Israel and the European Union, there needs to be an exclusion clause referring to settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Now, I'm standing in the Israeli settlement of Ariel. Behind me is the university that was founded 31 years ago and which today has a student population of 14,000. Degrees that are awarded here are recognized by the Israeli Higher Council for Education. But this latest move by the European Union is bad news not only for settlements like this one, but also for universities like the one you see behind me. What it states is that there needs to be a prohibition on all grants, scholarships, prizes and money that is awarded unless there is this exclusion clause. Now, it is estimated that this will affect some 40% of Israeli institutions, including large corporations and banks that have indirect ties with the settlements. Palestinians and their allies have congratulated and welcomed this move, saying that it is an important political and cultural boycott on the settlement movement. But the Israelis are angry, particularly the right-wing elements in Netanyahu's government, who say that they're now going to step up their cause to end any kind of gestures for a resumption of peace talks with the Palestinians. Paul Slier, RT, in the Ariel settlement, West Bank.
Well, to discuss this further, we're joined by a member of European Parliament, Paul Murphy, and the Jerusalem Post's chief political correspondent, Gil Hoffman. Gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Paul, I want to begin with you. The European Union never officially approved of the Israeli settlements, but has also never taken action, real, genuine action before. Why now, do you think?
I think primarily it's a reflection of pressure from below in Europe, whereby many people are fed up with what is in reality the ongoing complicity of the European Union with the oppression of the Palestinians, where on the one hand you have crocodile tears about the Palestinians, but then fundamentally you have support, including money, politically, for the Israeli establishment. And so the pressure simply has become too much for the European Commission, and so they've introduced these guidelines. It'll be up to significant pressure continuing to be built and applied to see that the guidelines are actually implemented in such a way that has an effect. If they are implemented fully and to the letter, they can have an effect, can be worth probably hundreds of millions of euro on a yearly basis, not being transferred to Israeli institutions involved in the occupation. But above all, I think it has a political significance, and because of that pressure from below, and it's a step forward. I would say it has to go significantly further. It's not good enough that settlement goods could still enter into the European markets. There should be a ban on settlement goods, but it's also not good enough that even while they're doing this, there is still an upgrading of relations between the European Union and Israel happening.
Well, I do want to let, I'm sorry for interrupting, I do want to let Gil weigh in here. I mean, we've heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu. He says that he will not effectively accept what he calls external dictates on the situation. He won't let what he described as Israeli settlers being harmed. But do you feel that Israel really has a choice here? Is this genuine pressure? And can Israel effectively afford to lose these EU funds?
Absolutely not. Israel wants to cooperate with Europe. Israel realizes the important role that Europe can play. And that's why it's so important that Europe be smart with the money and all the other influence that they have here in the region and not take steps that distance peace. There was something in your report that wasn't entirely accurate when they said that the right was primarily upset by this decision in Israel. Actually, I think the left was more upset. The people who want there to be a peace process, the people who want there to be two states for two peoples for Israel's own good, and see unilateral steps like this from Europe that make it so much harder to achieve peace.
But and I'm curious, staying with you, Gil, with Mr. Netanyahu saying that he refuses to accept external pressure on the borders. I mean, isn't that in some ways perhaps a declaration, a preemptive declaration of not necessarily wanting to negotiate in a peaceful solution?
What's going on right now as we speak is that John Kerry is on his way to Ramallah to try to beg the Palestinians to come to the negotiating table, which the Americans have been doing for 5 years, while Israel has been at the table waiting for them. This is an Israel that it's very hard for Israel to give up the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. And yet, because we want there to be two states for two peoples, that's what Netanyahu wants, because we want to see an end to the conflict, Netanyahu is willing to do it. And now the Palestinians are hardening their positions. They're saying, we have Europe on our side. Why should we give in to John Kerry? So already right now, as we speak, attempts to make there be peace in the Middle East are much harder because of mistakes made by a European bureaucrat who is obviously uninformed as to how much harm he's causing the Palestinian people.
Paul, do you agree with that perspective? What's your reaction to this?
I don't agree. Let's look at what is the role of the settlements in this situation. The settlements are clearly an obstacle, and a conscious obstacle by the Israeli establishment to the creation of a viable Palestinian state. You've had a massive expansion of settlements over the past 12 years, a doubling of settlers in the occupied territories, but in particular in the last year, an expansion of settlements around East Jerusalem designed to cut off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank to try and make a viable Palestinian state impossible. And so, you can't have genuine peace talks on the basis of, well, we're going to maintain our settlements, we're going to maintain the occupation, we're going to maintain the blockade on Gaza. And the point is that the removal of the settlements is absolutely necessary in terms of any basis for a viable Palestinian state, and that's why it's correct to have a focus and an emphasis on it.
But Paul, staying with you, I mean, the situation in these areas for the Palestinians isn't necessarily a stable one. There's a lot of political turmoil. Are the Palestinians in a position to be a reliable negotiating partner at this point?
Well, the fundamental point is I think the Israeli capitalist establishment is not a reliable negotiating partner. There will be no real peace as long as the establishment in Israel remains in power. They have to be massively challenged. They can be through a massive movement of Palestinians from below, which there is the potential of. You've seen significant protests, significant movements, the potential to redevelop a struggle along the lines of the First Intifada. That's the kind of thing that is necessary. Such a movement could link up with the genuine Israeli left, with working people and young people who don't benefit from the oppression of the Palestinians, overthrow the capitalist establishment in Israel and struggle for a genuine peace, which can only build. The negotiators here have to be ordinary working people, Israeli people, Palestinian people, not the representatives of the elites backed up by the US, backed up by the EU.
And Gil, I do want to get back to you. I mean, Israel does in some ways seem to be paying a heavy price, at least politically, in terms of its ties with the U.S. and the EU for expansion, settlement expansion beyond the Green Line. Do you think that this is a price that's worth for Israel to pay in order to gain this territory?
Look, the fate of what will remain part of Israel or what would become part of a Palestinian state will be decided in negotiations. One side or an external side getting involved and dictating in advance where the border is going to be isn't going to help anyone. Now, we already know that the Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem are going to be part of Israel forever. Settlement blocks will be part of Israel forever. Perhaps saying that Israel shouldn't build in far-flung areas that will be part of a Palestinian state makes sense. But what Europe has done here is drawn the line arbitrarily, and where 700,000 people live. That's really hard, and that's unfair. And so you have an elected Israeli government, despite what the gentleman from the European Parliament says. We have a moderate parliament that we elected that has 59 seats out of 120 on the left, very evenly distributed. These people want there to be two states for two peoples. And the very fact that the European Parliament member would rather see uprisings, intifadas, and war and death, it's just really, really unfortunate. We should have democracy, and it's time for Europe to stop undermining democracy and allow there to be peace, and stop taking actions against peace that would result in thousands of Palestinians being unemployed, losing their livelihood. Democracy, peace, yes. War, uprisings, and death, no.
And Paul, very briefly, we're almost out of time. You have about 30 seconds. I want to give you a chance to respond.
There is war, there's death, there's poverty, there's oppression, and it's caused by the actions of the Israeli government against the Palestinians in Gaza, against the Palestinians within the borders of 67, against the Palestinians within the West Bank. The only resolution is on the basis of such a struggle. That's the way justice can actually be taken. That's not an action against peace, it's an action for peace. And the idea that aggressive acts is not what's happening here. The aggressive act is the expansion of settlements, the robbing of Palestinian homes. That's what an aggressive act is taking place here.
Well, gentlemen, I think the discussion here really symbolizes just how difficult it is to move forward in this case. Thank you so much. We were just joined live by European Parliament member Paul Murphy and the Jerusalem Post's chief political correspondent Gil Hoffman. Thank you both.